Today I'm going to take a look at 4 species of onion or garlic that you might find growing wild in the UK. 3 of them are native, 1 is a Schedule 9 invasive species. Let's start with Ramsons. This is a native wild garlic or wild onion that grows abundantly in damp and shady places. It especially likes shady woodland and the banks of rivers and streams. There's a similar and related species, Allium tricoccum, meaning 3-seeded garlic, that grows in the USA and is known as ramps there. But the northern European species is Allium ursinum, meaning bear garlic or bear leek, even though we don't have bears here in the UK anymore. Ramsons has broad, spear-shaped leaves that are bright, fresh green, arising from a fleshy white or pale green stem that grows from a small, soft bulb underground. I can't dig up any of those to show you here because you need permission from the landowner to uproot plants here in the UK. Picking leaves is generally okay as long as the plant is not endangered or protected, but digging anything up requires permission. There are a few different things you might accidentally mistake for Ramsons. Here's a species of dock that's growing right alongside it. Although that's edible, so nothing bad would probably happen from picking that by mistake, it just doesn't taste the same. Wild arum, on the other hand, also known as lords and ladies or cuckoo pint and many other names, is putting up its green spear-shaped leaves at around about the same time as Ramsons, and it likes to grow in a lot of the same places as Ramsons. In fact, here's a place where the 2 plants are growing right next to each other, and that's really common. Wild arum is poisonous, possibly deadly if consumed in any quantity, although fatal poisonings are quite rare because it causes painful burning blistering to the mouth, and for most people they stop eating it when that happens. The leaves of wild arum are actually shaped like a big arrowhead with a pair of points facing back towards the direction of the stem, quite different from Ramsons, and once grown it's also a larger and more robust plant, so it's really the young leaves that are the most troublesome in terms of misidentification or accidental picking. Another possible mix-up for Ramsons is lily of the valley, very toxic and again grows in some of the same places as Ramsons. I don't know of anywhere this grows wild near me, but here it is in a friend's garden, and I'll show you some other pictures of it. The leaves do look reasonably similar, but they don't smell of onions. More about that in a moment. The most conspicuous difference between these plants is the flowers. The Ramsons flowers are spiky, pure white, star-shaped flowers that radiate from a spherical umbel at the top of the flower stalk. Lily of the Valley has creamy white flowers that are like little nodding bells, strung along the stalk. I've got a separate video about foraging safety, which I'll link in this card and in the video description, and I will talk more about safely foraging wild onions a bit later in this video. Now you might have noticed that I use the terms onion, leek and garlic more or less interchangeably in the context of wild onions and wild garlic, and that's because the distinction between these terms is vague and mostly culinary. All of them are species of allium, and nature doesn't care if you call it garlic or onion. All of these plants produce the chemicals, sulfur compounds, that give onions and garlic their characteristic pungent aroma. You may or may not be aware that Adam Ragusa recently published a video that covers some of the same ground and contains some of the same information as this one. If you haven't seen that video, I recommend it and I'll link it here, as he also covers some aspects of this topic that I won't go into, and vice versa. Anyway, those sulfur chemicals are a group of compounds, and each plant tends to have its own unique blend. And that's interesting for us foraging because it means each plant has its own unique flavours and aromas for cooking. Talking of different flavours, here's crow garlic, Allium vineale. This one has foliage that you might consider more typical for onions and garlic, tubular leaves that grow in an upright bunch. A bit like chives, but this is not chives, hold that thought. Crow garlic is fond of well-drained, sandy or gravelly soils, and I most often find it on raised or sloping ground. I often see it on roadside banks, like here. I wouldn't pick it from here for the table though, because of possible contamination from the road. It's also common as a coastal plant growing on banks and dunes above the tide line. Crow garlic leaves are sort of ridged with corrugations along their length that you'll feel if you roll one of the leaves between your fingers. The leaves are slightly bluish green because of a waxy coating they have. Glaucous is the term. They remind me of an old-fashioned hosepipe if you've ever seen one of those, this sort of thing. I can't show you crow garlic flowers because I've never seen them. In summer the plant sends up what would be flowering stalks, but in the area where I live there are no flowers, just clusters of small bulbs called bulbils, lovely word. And the plant reproduces itself by cloning via these bulbils, which detach from the flower stem and grow into new independent plants. Sometimes crow garlic does produce flowers and sometimes a mixture of flowers and bulbils. It seems to be a bit regional. Around here it seems to be always only bulbils. They're about the size of grains of wheat, and they are edible like the rest of the plant. I will try to remember to pick some and cook something with them later this year. Unlike Ramsons, which I would describe as pungently fresh green garlic, crow garlic has a sort of spicy and savoury garlic smell, almost meaty in its savoury aroma, if that makes sense, and I think it also has a slightly earthy flavour, like the earthiness of root vegetables such as beetroot or parsnip. The leaves can be a bit coarse and rough though, so whilst it looks a bit like chives, it's a bit fibrous, not as soft and tender as chives, probably best used chopped very small and cooked in soups and things like that. Here's crow garlic next to chives from my garden. Crow garlic leaves are hollow and coarsely crescent-shaped in cross-section. Chives are smooth and usually circular. Chives probably need very little introduction. I've got a bunch growing here in the garden, but this is another species that does occur natively in the UK. I've found it growing wild a few times, but usually fairly close to civilization, so it's possible the plants I found could have just been garden escapes. And finally, my nemesis, three-cornered leek, Allium trichetrum. This one is not native to the UK and is in fact listed as an invasive species, and don't I know it. It arrived in my garden a number of years ago, probably as a single stalk or a seed in a potted plant that we bought somewhere, and it quickly spread everywhere. There are other gardens near me that are also overrun with it, and I understand the seeds of this plant are distributed by ants, so it's possible it came in that way instead. It's native to the Mediterranean, but it can be found naturalised and vigorously invading in damp and shady woodlands in many places in Devon and Cornwall. If it were not so vigorously invasive, it would be quite a nice plant. Fresh green foliage and stalks topped with little clusters of translucent white bell-shaped flowers, with a faint green stripe in the middle of each petal. Quite pretty really, if it wasn't such a monster. The flower stalks have a triangular cross-section, which is where this plant gets its name, Allium trichetrum. The flavour is mild and sweetly oniony, like a milder, sweeter and more juicy version of spring onions, or you might call those scallions. If you do find some growing and you decide to forage it, you should be really careful not to help it spread to new places, either by seeds or by bulb offsets. About that, and this is part of the reason why it spreads and why it's almost impossible to eradicate it from my garden, when I dig up one of these plants, we'll see that the main bulb and stem is surrounded by small offset bulbs. Again, the plant is cloning itself, and when you dig up a plant, you never get all of these little bulbs, so the plant just comes back. I'll be picking some of this to cook in today's video, but first a little bit more about safety. So at the same time as all of these wild garlics or wild onions are sprouting in spring, so are lots and lots of other things, and a lot of those other things are superficially similar in appearance and also poisonous. For example, the daffodil or narcissus. These have glaucous blue-green strap-like leaves that look pretty oniony but are toxic. There are also bluebells, beautiful but again toxic. You might think that the blue flowers on bluebells are a dead giveaway, but they also come in white varieties that do look somewhat similar to the flowers of some of the onion species we've been looking at. And here you can see crow garlic growing amongst bluebells and daffodils. It's quite possible to tell the difference, you just need to be careful and pay attention. Other things that might pose a risk include spring snowflake, which looks like this, and snowdrops, which are finished flowering when I made this video, but the leaves are now just green strips like so many other spring bulbs. One thing people sometimes recommend is the sniff test. Basically crush the plant, and if it smells of onion or garlic, it is. Which is more or less true, although there are still a few possible pitfalls with things like fritillaries, which have a strong smell that isn't exactly oniony, but it's pungent in a similar sort of way. And there are other plants that smell of onion, although you're unlikely to mistake them for onions, such as this stuff, garlic mustard or Jack by the Hedges, which people say has a sort of garlic aroma when crushed, even though it's a member of the unrelated mustard family, but again, sulfur compounds at work. But there's a problem with the sniff test, which I will now demonstrate. I pick a dandelion, crush the stem and smell it. I can smell garlic. Dandelions are not remotely related to garlic, so why does this one smell of garlic? Well, let's rewind. It's because before I picked the dandelion, I picked and crushed some Ramsons. The dandelion smells of garlic because my hands smell of garlic now. So the sniff test then might be useful for learning to identify wild garlic in the first place, but if you haven't learned the differences between, say, Ramsons and lily of the valley, and if you find them growing together, the sniff test is useless after you've picked the first stem of wild garlic because the smell will be on your hands. So really, being able to visually differentiate these plants is also very, very important. But Plant identification is just like any other identification skill. It is something that can be learned by practice, just like people learn to tell the difference between a Lamborghini and a Ferrari, or the difference between Magikarp and Phoebus, or the difference between Russell Crowe and Gerard Butler. It's possible to learn to observe the differences between plants and use those differences to conclusively identify them. Anyway, I'm going to cook something with three-cornered leek now. And an additional little safety tip from me, when I pick this plant, I ensure that I'm picking only this plant and not all of the other potentially deadly things growing nearby in my garden, by finding a flower stem and following that flower stem down and pulling the whole of that plant in one piece. Time to go over now to kitchen shrimp for the recipe. So today's recipe, I'm going to make some sort of savoury stuffed pastry thing, which is going to contain my wild garlic, of course, but I'm going to put some lentils in as well. So let's have about 75 grams of lentils. So I've just got those covered with water and about probably half a centimetre of depth of water on top of them. Red split lentils like these don't require pre-soaking and they don't take very long to cook either. That'll take maybe 15 to 20 minutes of simmering. I am just going to put some of this stock powder in just for a bit of extra flavour. For the pastry for this, I'm going to make rough puff pastry, which is like a kind of quick way to make a flaky pastry. So we're going to have 250 grams of flour. I'm using a mixture of strong bread flour and regular plain flour. The strong flour will just give it a little bit more structure. I'm going to be using a mixture of butter and lard for this, just because that's what I happen to have to hand. Just going to cut that into pieces as it goes in. We are going to very quickly rub it in, but not completely. So yeah, lard, you could use beef dripping, you could use a vegetable baking fat. I just happen to have some lard in the fridge from a different recipe, so I'm using it up. So 250 grams of flour to about 150 grams of fat, which is less than some recipes call for. And then this fat, I'm just going to cut it into the flour like this. So not even rubbing it in with my fingers, I'm just running a knife through it to cut those pieces of fat into smaller chunks first. To make rough puff, you really need to be able to see pieces of fat in the mix, because that's what will give it the lamination. When you make proper flaky puff pastry, it's more like making croissant mixed. You laminate the pastry with a layer of butter and then you fold and roll and fold and roll. This is a bit of a dodge for that. There's still going to be lamination, but it's just going to come from the fact that there are chunks of fat incorporated into the dough. Hopefully that will become clearer as we go on. So I'm just going to cut that in until the pieces of fat I can see are maybe less than a centimetre in size. So yeah, we can see chunks of fat in there. So those lentils are now cooked. That only took about 10 minutes and yep, completely cooked and swelled up. Just actually give those a little taste. Yep, completely done. So I'm going to leave that open and let the steam come out of it because I want that to dry out a bit more. Now a little pinch of salt, a big pinch of dried sage because I like sage, and now cold water. We're going to need somewhere in the region of 150 ml of water for this, but this is one of these kind of eyeball it type of situations. So I'm just going to add, that's probably about 100 ml of water, and we'll stir it and see if it comes together. A little bit more because we've got some dry flour down the bottom there. That's probably about 120 ml of water in total now. This is one of these things you really got to feel it because your flour may absorb more or less water than mine. So it's just necessary really to go by feel on this one. And I would say we're there. Generously floured board because this dough will be sticky to start with. And then with floured hands, the absolute minimum of kneading to bring it together into a ball, because see those chunks of fat and well butter and lard in there, we really just got to preserve those. So I'm not folding it and kneading it, I'm just pushing it together. That's good. Bit more flour and then we roll it. And the books all say in one direction only, so okay, we'll do that. So you roll it out like that, and then we do top third and bottom third. And then I'm going to roll in the opposite direction, like that. And you can still see streaks of fat in there. And that's what we really want for this. So there we go. And again, top third, bottom third. And that's it. Now that's going to go in the fridge and rest for about half an hour, just for the gluten to all work together and bind the pastry. Also for that fat to chill down and become more solid, because that will prevent it from just oozing into the pastry. So I'm going to wrap that up. This is just a piece of plastic harvested from a cereal bag, which I just opened out flat. From the bag inside of a cereal box. Okay, that's going to go in the fridge now for at least half an hour, which means we've got to go and pick that garlic now. Okay, so a big pile of three-cornered leeks from the garden. The whole plant is edible, but not the whole plant is good to eat. So I'm just going to give this a wash, pick out any bits that maybe don't look quite as good as the rest, chop it up, and then we're going to fry it to reduce the moisture content. Now, as I'm sure I will have already mentioned in the theory section of this video, this plant is incredibly invasive, and my garden is pretty much a lost cause for it. So I picked this whole basket full of three-cornered leeks, and when I was finished picking, well, you can see how much difference it didn't make to that. So what I'm doing here, there's some little bits at the bottom of the stems which tend to be just gummy bits of leaf that are no good to eat, and sometimes you get dirt trapped in the bottom of the stems here just because of the way they splay out. So it's worth pulling these apart just to make sure it's all nice and clean. And then I'm just going to chop it into small pieces just for easier handling at the moment. It's going into a colander to drain, and then I will cut it to the final size in a moment. I'm not taking the flowers off because those can also be eaten. So this washing process is pretty much about the removal of foreign bodies as well as dirt. So this gives me a chance to sift through it and make sure that the thing I've picked is the thing I want to eat and not something else. And you can see why this is called three-cornered leek, because the bottom of the stem here is kind of leek-like. As I say, onions, the whole of the onion family, doesn't really care about our various terminology for leeks, onions and garlic. These are just plants doing their thing. The aroma that I'm getting from preparing all of this is quite mild and oniony. It's not, there is a faint aroma of classic garlic flavour, but mostly what I'm getting here is kind of mild onion or leek. So again, probably part of the reason why this is called three-cornered leek and not garlic. Okay, well, you've seen enough of the washing. So not a lot of dirt came off of that, but I think it was worth washing it. Some of that dirt is gritty. So I don't know what weight of garlic I've got there at the moment actually, but I'll weigh it including the colander, and then I'll weigh the colander afterwards. 745 grams including the colander. I'll weigh the colander when it's empty and subtract it. So the amount of garlic I'm using in this first bit is this number on the screen. So now, my three-cornered leek, I'm going to chop into pieces about 1 centimetre long. This is where we will start to really smell it. Yeah, still just a kind of mild, oniony, pleasantly green onion sort of smell. And that's going to go into a pan that I've already put a little bit of oil into. So this might seem like a lot of onion, and maybe it is, but I'm expecting this will cook down quite significantly. But also this dish is about this ingredient, so Let's not skimp on the amount. The colander weight was 225 grams, so I think we've got about 500, just a little over 500 grams of three-cornered leek here, which is quite a lot, but that's going to reduce down a lot when it cooks, I think. And you can see how much liquid there is in here. Some of that obviously is the water that was adhering to the stems from washing them. But I'm just going to cook this until it stops bubbling like that. But it's interesting to see how much that's already reduced in volume. These have been cooking about 10 minutes now, and you can see how much liquid is still coming out of them, although it is reducing down now. What I think I'm going to do now is let those cool, and then I can squeeze the last little bit of liquid out with my hands. Now the reason for squeezing this juice out is obviously we're going to bake this inside pastry, and I don't want it to be too wet or else we'll just end up with a soggy bottom.
The place where he was born and raised.
So my onions are going to go into this bowl, and I've drained off the juice and reserved it and squeezed a bit out as well. I'll keep that and I'll use it to make gravy. Amazing how much those onions have cooked down from that great big basket full, which filled my entire pan, down to this amount. Now the cooked lentils. Looks good. Well, I say it looks good. It looks like I was hoping it would. Whole grain mustard now, and I'm going to put in about a tablespoonful of whole grain mustard. And just to help that come together and soak up any additional juice that might come out of the onions, about a handful of rolled oats. One more main ingredient to go in the filling, which is mature cheddar cheese. This is a really nice, crumbly, mature cheddar. Really nice and strong and sharp. And what I'll do, I don't know how much this is going to be, so I will grate it directly into the bowl, and then I'll tell you the weight I put in at the end. That's just a shade over 70 grams at the moment. Let's mix that in and see what it looks like. A little bit more. So that was 100 grams of grated strong cheddar cheese in total. Obviously you could use other cheeses here if that's what you prefer. I really like cheese and onion, and cheddar cheese and onion is a fantastic combination, and the mustard, I hope, will just really enhance that. Okay, that's my filling. Now I need to get that pastry back and roll it out to enclose this. There is of course also no reason why I can't, at this stage, have a little taste. That's actually really good. Now, some people will be wondering, where's the salt? Someone always does. Don't forget, there was salt in that stock powder I put in to the lentils, and there's salt in cheddar cheese as well. So that's the salt for this dish. It doesn't need any more than that. Obviously your tastes might vary on that, but that's salt enough for me. I'm just going to make a kind of judgment. I'm going to make 4 little sort of pasty type of things out of this. So I'm going to make a judgment on how much filling I've got. Just divide it roughly into 4 pieces in the bowl so I can get an idea of how big to roll out the pastry. And there's the pastry after chilling in the fridge. And as discussed, you can see pieces of butter and lard. You can see streaks of fat in amongst that pastry. That's exactly what I want. I'm going to divide that into 4 pieces. And you won't get lamination in here like you would do on a puff pastry or a croissant dough, but it is enough to give it a little bit of a puff and a rise and give it flaky texture. That's the theory. It's been a long time since I made rough puff, so this could be interesting. I'm just going to roll them out into squares, well, rectangles actually, because I want the final thing to be kind of square. Yeah, I reckon that's about right. That's about 1/4 of the filling. I think that's about right. And on this one occasion, I am just going to trim off a tiny bit of pastry just to tidy it up. Just brush off the excess flour from the top. And I don't think this will need any kind of extra fat on this tray because quite a fatty pastry, so I'm expecting that it will unstick itself. Now, you didn't think I'd leave these little bits here to go to waste, did you? I'm going to try something weird here, which is these tiny little scraps of filling that are left over, I'm just going to toss that together with those bits of pastry, like that. And then, just going to roll that out and make a kind of a cracker. And that can bake in the oven at the same time. We'll see what happens. The oven is preheating. That's the thrumming sound you can hear. It's the oven, not the Ark of the Covenant. Just going to egg wash these. So just a beaten egg. And this will just give them a nice golden crust, hopefully. And they're not all the same shape, and that doesn't really matter. I could have been more precise than this and got them all exactly the same shape. Could have gone for different shapes, actually. Could have rolled the dough out into a circle and made empanada style pasties or something. But actually with this rough puff pastry, you want to do as little shaping as you possibly can. So you basically cut it and roll it into the shape that it wants to be. That's why these are rectangular. Once the fat's kind of in those layers inside the pastry, you just want to do as little rolling and reshaping as you possibly can, or else you just break up the fat and you end up, it still works, you end up with short crust pastry, but you don't get the puff. And then I'm just going to cut some slits in the top of here to help the steam come out as it bakes. That leftover egg wash, Eva can have a little bit of scrambled egg on her lunch. You good? That was about 40 minutes in total. Yeah, I think those are done. They're nice and crispy on top. The pastry's kind of cracked apart, but that's completely normal for rough puff. And so I'm just going to transfer these to a wire rack to cool, because at the moment the filling is going to be cheesy, oniony napalm. Very happy with the way they've held together. Meanwhile, there's this weird cracker thing which is done. It took less time to cook than the pies did. I think we should give that a little taste. Yeah, that's all right. I can taste all of the ingredients. I can taste the onions, the cheese, the mustard, even the lentils. There is something quite wonderful about lard-based pastry. So I'm just going to let these cool down for a little bit before we serve them. While that's happening, I think I'm going to cook some mashed potatoes to have with them. Of course, these could just be eaten out of hand as a snack or as a picnic, but I'm going to serve it as the kind of main piece of a light lunch. So we're going to have that with mash, and I'm going to make a little sauce to go with it as well. A little bit of butter, a little bit of flour, just cook that roux for a little bit. And then, just in case those pies aren't oniony enough, I've got this reserve liquid from cooking the drained onions. So kind of green gravy. As that thickens a little bit, just have a little bit of water in there, tiny pinch of salt. And then in case anything here was in danger of being insufficiently oniony, I've just picked a few leaves of chives from the garden. I'm just going to snip those in there. So I'm making what looks a bit like a pie liquor sauce that you might get in a pie and mash shop. This is not really anything like that though. Let's have a look at that. Yeah, I think that'll do. Okay, so there it is. And I am going to have that with some mash in a minute, but let's just have a bite first and see what it's like inside. Cheesy. Only really mildly oniony. The mustard comes through, and the lentils just give it a really nice bite. That's nice. You know what you think?
Yeah, it's alright actually. The onion is not very strong.
Yeah. Yeah, I think they're really mild, those three-cornered leeks.
Very mild. Is it cheese in it?
Yeah, it's mature cheddar and mustard. So I'm really happy with that. That was quite a bit of effort, but this is free vegetables, and I really wanted to kind of make something that would use them to their fullest effect. Okay, future shrimp here, and I thought we'd just have a quick look, or rather perhaps listen to this pastry. So what we've got is a very, very nice flaky, open textured pastry, and that texture is created by those streaks of fat that got kind of squished and smeared between the bits of raw dough. As that fat cooks, it melts into the pastry, but it also leaves a gap that then steam can expand. The filling has obviously lost a little bit of its fresh greenness, but that's kind of unavoidable, and that would have happened if this was spinach or anything else. So that's what they look like on the inside. And these can be eaten cold like this, or they would reheat in the microwave the next day. Well, I thought that was really nice and tasty, actually. I enjoyed that. I've still got 2 left for my sort of midweek lunches. Yeah, I would say that, I mean, that onion, it's really mild, isn't it? It's milder than Leeks, I would say.
Definitely.
Similar flavour to Leeks, but even milder, which means you can use a lot of it. While we were eating it, I kind of came to the realisation that it tastes like if you'd mixed Leeks and spinach. So I hope that's been interesting. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.